This is a family picture that was taken on our driveway in Edmonton in 1972. My mom and dad with my sister Elaine and my brother Ross and I, and Grandma and Grandpa Staples visiting from Manitoba. This is the only photo I have where Grandpa Harold and I are in the same shot. I would have been 2 years old here, sitting there safely in my mom's arms. And at this point, Grandpa was only about a year away from his death. In fact, this was probably his last visit to see us in Edmonton before he died. Harold Evans Staples is my grandfather on my mom's side, and he lived for almost 77 years. Mom tells me that when I was a toddler, I used to sit with Grandpa and comb his hair, and I feel like I have a vague memory of that. Just under 4% of his lifetime was spent as a soldier in the Great War, which doesn't sound like a significant amount of time, really. But I think it's safe to say that for him and so many other Canadian soldiers, that 4% was probably the most intense, life-altering period of his entire life. What follows is Grandpa Harold's story, or at least a 3-year period of that story. From the spring of 1916, when he signed up for service in Swan River, Manitoba, then all through his time spent overseas, and finally to the spring of 1919, when he came back onto Canadian soil after having experienced a significant amount of combat. This video has been put together really as a labor of love for my extended family, many of whom may not know Grandpa Harold's story in the Great War, and I think it's time that we did. May we as Canadians never forget the sacrifices and the service of our military veterans. We owe them so very much. Harold Evans Staples was born in Treherne, Manitoba on the 23rd of July, 1896. When he was not quite 4 years old, his father died suddenly while digging a well. In the spring of 1916, at the age of 19, Harold signed up to serve with the Canadian Expeditionary Force. When he signed up, the Great War had already been raging for about 20 months. Harold joined with several other young men, filling out his papers in Swan River, Manitoba, at the office of Captain Frank Scrace, who was a local butcher. It was the 24th of March, 1916. Harold and the other new recruits stayed in Swan River for another 2 months, practicing marching, basic drills, and trench digging. Then, on the 25th of May, the Swan River ladies presented Harold and each of the new recruits a pair of socks, a bar of soap, and a flower bouquet. A week later, the young men boarded a train on their way to Camp Hughes, east of Brandon. At Camp Hughes, they would be subjected to more rigorous military training with men from all over the province. I'm standing here in the summer of 2024 at what remains of the Camp Hughes site. This camp began in 1909 as a militia training ground, and then when the Great War began, the camp greatly expanded. In 1915 and 1916, around 40,000 soldiers from both Saskatchewan and Manitoba were trained here. There was an extensive trench training system, part of which, or the remains of which, you can see behind me here. There was a rifle range, a grenade range, and miles of canvas tents that housed the soldiers while they were here in the months before they went to France, England, and then France. There were also theaters, shops, even a swimming pool at Camp Hughes. In 1927, the camp was abandoned, and then in 1933 it was decommissioned, and the military training that happened here moved just west to CFB Shiloh, where there still is a military base, of course, today. In 2011, Camp Hughes was declared an official National Historic Site. While at Camp Hughes, Harold officially joined the 226th Overseas Battalion, made up of men from a variety of Manitoba towns. In 1916, a battalion was made up of 35 officers and 977 other ranks. So, Private Harold Staples now became one of 977 other ranks in the 226th Battalion. Harold was assigned to number 1 platoon, pictured here, just one of 15 platoons that made up the 226th. After a brief leave of absence from Camp Hughes to go help with the fall harvest back home, Harold then rejoined his battalion, traveling by train to Halifax in November 1916, there to engage in final preparations before sailing for Europe. On the 16th of December 1916, Harold, along with his brother Ira and thousands of other Canadian soldiers, embarked onto the SS Olympic. The Olympic was an 882-foot coal-powered ocean liner that was the older sister ship of the Titanic. For the 4 nights docked in Halifax, followed by 6 nights at sea, Harold would have been sleeping in a hammock in very crowded spaces with hundreds of other soldiers. On the 20th of December 1916, the ship, captained by Sir Bertram Hayes and loaded up with coal and soldiers, set sail on its 10th wartime voyage from Halifax to Liverpool. As they pulled out of the Halifax harbor, light snow dusted the ocean. The men celebrated Christmas on board ship, and on Boxing Day 1916, after 6 days crossing the Atlantic, they docked in Liverpool. Once landed in the UK, Harold went to Bramshot Camp for a few months, and then it was off to Shorncliffe Camp, located only 4 miles from the sea. On the 31st of May 1917, Harold was transferred from the 226th Battalion into the 27th Infantry Battalion, and it was in B Company of the 27th Battalion that Harold would experience all his combat. The first day that Harold ever set foot in France was June 1st, 1917. Less than 3 months later, he'd find himself participating in his first battle, the Battle of Hill 70.
Our battalion was assigned the job of taking a place known as Hill 70, which had been taken and lost 9 times previously. We made some progress in the first stages of the early morning hours, but were forced to fall back later with heavy losses. We were relieved that night by an English battalion, a very welcome relief. Only 6 of our platoon of 40 answered the roll call the next day, my brother and I being 2 of them. From the Diary of Harold Evans Staples.
In that portion of his diary, Harold was recounting the events of the 21st of August, 1917, at Hill 70, just northeast of a coal mining town called Lens in northern France. By the time Harold and the men arrived in the area, the town of Lens and the surrounding territory had been already ravaged by years of fighting. And looking out on the scene, Harold and his buddies would have noticed a variety of slag heaps, untold numbers of craters, and several decimated red brick buildings. What were the Canadians doing there? What was the purpose of the 10 days' worth of grim and bloody battles that transpired in that area? Well, the battle for Hill 70 was but a piece in a larger puzzle, and it went like this. The British general Douglas Haig had wanted to end the German U-boat threat on the Belgian coast and had been considering a seaborne attack there. But Haig foresaw a German victory on the coast unless significant numbers of German troops could be diverted to another area to fight a different battle. and it was decided that that different battle would take place at Ypres. But even before that battle at Ypres took place, the Allies could either kill or hold down many of the German soldiers who might have gone there by attacking them in places they were already occupying. Places that were important to the German command, like Hill 70 and the town of Lens. The Canadians would attempt to take the high ground close to the town of Lens. They would attempt to take Hill 70, knowing that the Germans would strongly resist and lose significant men in the process, men who would have gone to Ypres. So Hill 70 was planned to be a sort of kill zone where German numbers would be decreased on purpose. Now, in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, a brigade was larger than a battalion. In fact, a brigade was made up of battalions. Both the 6th and the 10th Brigades of the Canadian Forces were involved in the fighting on the 21st of August, 1917. And where the 6th Brigade was concerned, leading the charge that day was Harold's 27th Battalion, along with the 29th and the 28th Battalion playing a support role, with the 31st Battalion in reserve. The operation undertaken that day was supposed to have happened days earlier, but had been postponed due to incomplete preparations and poor visibility. But at 4:35 a.m. on the 21st of August, having already been surprised by enemy artillery fire, the Canadians, Harold included, left Chicory Trench toward their objectives of Cinnabar, Combat, and Nuns Alley trenches. The fighting was particularly horrific. About 2 months prior, the Germans had introduced 2 new weapons into their arsenal, the flamethrower and mustard gas. The flamethrower sprayed a 25-yard flame for 30-second intervals and was highly effective in its purpose. Mustard gas caused terrible blisters to form on exposed skin and in lungs that inhaled it. Now just imagine facing those dire threats while also having to negotiate barbed wire, while also facing thousands of bullets from German rifles and machine guns, along with shelling from their artillery, and further having to bayonet people in life or death, hand-to-hand combat. This was the situation for Harold and his fellow soldiers on the 21st of August. As Harold and his buddies inched closer to the German positions, German soldiers suddenly emerged from dugouts, from cellars, from shell craters, and it was kill or be killed without many places to hide. As for the grim work of bayoneting, and there was lots of it that day, consider these quotes from a 1916 Canadian bayonet training manual.
The bayonet is essentially an offensive weapon. Go straight at an opponent with the point threatening his throat and deliver the point wherever an opening presents itself. If no opening is obvious, one must be created by beating off the opponent's weapon or making a feint point in order to make him uncover himself. In a bayonet assault, all ranks go forward to kill or be killed, and only those who have developed skill and strength by constant training will be able to kill.
There are many records of the sheer difficulty of the battle on August 21st. One such record is found in the 6th Brigade report.
The fighting throughout was of a desperate nature, such as had never before been experienced by their brigade.
For Harold and his fellow soldiers, August 21st had turned out to be a terrible day. Despite making some gains early in the day, by late afternoon, most of the exhausted and depleted troops of the 27th and 29th battalions were forced to withdraw backward to the positions that they'd started at in the early morning. The losses for the Canadians were enormous that day, with the 29th Battalion suffering the most. In total, 346 Canadian soldiers were killed or fatally wounded on August 21st, with another 728 men wounded by enemy fire and 74 men wounded by gas. Another 6 men had been taken prisoner. Indeed, a very terrible day. Among those who died at Hill 70 on the 21st of August were 5 young men who had signed up in Swan River, 4 of whom were in Harold's 27th Battalion.
Private Charles Thomas Faulkner, 27th Battalion, killed in action, age 37. Private John J. Gaskell, 27th Battalion, missing, presumed dead, age 25. Private William Rogerson Lawson, 27th Battalion, instantly killed from shrapnel from an enemy shell, age 31. Private Samuel Edward Truman, 27th Battalion, killed in action, age 37. Private Frank Moline, 29th Battalion, missing and presumed dead, age 20.
The Canadian General Arthur Currie wrote of Hill 70, "It was altogether the hardest battle in which the Corps had participated." The British war correspondent Philip Gibbs said, "This siege of Lens is the most frightful episode of the warfare on the Western Front." And toward the end of the battle report for the 27th Battalion, dated August 21st and 22nd, 1917, these words:
The spirit and drive shown by all ranks during this operation, which included the hardest and most difficult fighting ever encountered by this battalion, was conclusive evidence of the confidence of the men in themselves and their officers.
I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy.
After Harold's participation at Hill 70, it would be another 76 days before he would find himself fighting in another notable battle, the Battle of Passchendaele. Those 76 intervening days between Hill 70 and Passchendaele began with a 2-week period of rest, 20 kilometers northwest of Arras, France. Rest time was filled with training, military parades, and sports tournaments. And then for the remainder of September and the majority of October, Harold with his 27th Battalion were deployed to several areas north of Arras to relieve other battalions, including 3 days spent at Vimy Ridge, where the famous battle involving the Canadians had happened only 5.5 months prior. During those months of September and October 1917, the combat for Harold and his 27th Battalion was relatively light. Only 3 deaths and 19 wounded were reported. But in the early days of September, Harold's step-uncle, Robert Edward Abigail, 43rd Battalion, died of wounds sustained on the battlefield.
This man was severely wounded on September 1st, 1917, whilst doing frontline duty, and died of wounds, multiple compound fractures, both legs, at number 22 Casualty Clearing Station.
Like Harold, Robert Abigail had signed up for service in Swan River, and he'd also sailed to Europe with Harold on the Olympic. Robert was only 26 when he died. Finally, in late October 1917, Harold and his battalion boarded a train bound north for Passchendaele.
By October, we were in Belgium, where we were assigned to take part in the Battle of Passchendaele, which was another ridge in front of Ypres.
Harold's journey into the battlefield at Passchendaele had begun in the later days of October, with an uncomfortable 3-hour train ride to the site. August 1917 had been the wettest August in 30 years, making the earth at Passchendaele a soupy mess. There was a British Army general named Hubert Gough who described the earth at Passchendaele as fluid clay, with every shell hole a dismal pond, and hills and valleys alike being waves and troughs of a gigantic sea of mud.
We went up to Passchendaele, went up to Hazebrook on the train, and then we went over the tapes there, and finally marched up to Ypres and went into Passchendaele there, over about, I don't know how many miles of duckboards. The mud was awful. It was just, and it was the only way you could possibly get in. And I remember us going in there at night and walking along, and these wounded men hanging on to the edge of these duckboards, you see, with their body about half submerged in the mud and the water. And some of these fellas, not knowing they were there, would step on their fingers, you know. And the screams, oh, God, it would just haunt you, you know, to hear that. But strict orders, you couldn't help them, you couldn't do a damn thing, you just had to keep going.
I don't suppose there is any place on earth in quite such a mess as the surface of the earth surrounding Ypres. For over 6 miles the land is nothing but a sea of shell craters, the majority of which are full of water. Sergeant J.A. Bryce, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry.
The mud was not as it is known in the average experience, but alcohol smelling substance that is lived with, becomes steeped in one's very being until it is felt mentally as well as physically. Author A.O. Dawson, 1920.
Here a shattered tree trunk, there a wrecked pillbox, the sole remaining evidence that this was once a human and inhabited land. Dante would never have condemned lost souls to wander in so terrible a purgatory. Here a shattered wagon, there a gun mired to the muzzle in mud which grips like glue. Even the birds and rats have forsaken so unnatural a spot. Mile after mile of the same unending dreariness. Landmarks are gone, and of whole villages, hardly a pile of bricks amongst the mud marks the site. British Army Lieutenant Colonel C.E.L. Lynn.
The mud of Passchendaele included the bloated, unburied corpses of both men and horses. And there's record of the vile, very pungent odor of the battlefield wafting for kilometers. Truly a horrific, contaminated, deathly, and terrible place. By 4 a.m. on the 6th of November, Harold, along with hundreds of other men from the 27th, 26th, and 31st Battalions, were in their muddy, icy, cramped places at the jumping off point, ready to advance against the Germans on the village of Passchendaele. Harold's 27th Battalion was on the right side of the formation. The sky was overcast, but no rain. 0 hour came at 6 a.m. The troops were given the signal to advance, and over the top they went, following the heavy barrage of the artillery. The leading waves of the attack had been ordered to fire from the hip. As they advanced, behind a literal shower of metal, they were knee-deep or worse in mud, with enemy machine guns, shells, and airplanes firing heavily against them. By 7:40 a.m., all objectives had been captured. But for Harold, the victory had come at a cost. He described that cost in his diary.
We went over in the AM of November 6th and managed to make our objective. I was in the machine gun section. The gunner was killed and I was left in charge of the gun, the crew having got all disorganized. I held the post until night and was able to join some of the crew. During the night, got in the way of a shell, and by dawn found myself being taken back by stretcher bearer, which involved my admission to a number of hospitals.
On November 6, 1917, he received slight shrapnel wound of scalp and a contused right ankle, struck by falling timber. He was in hospitals in France 2 weeks and hospitals in Great Britain 6 weeks. Good recovery. Shrapnel wound, head, contused ankle, 6 November. Gunshot wound, head, scalp only, Passchendaele, November 6, 1917.
Now injured, Harold's name appeared in papers across Canada in late November 1917 under the banner Infantry Wounded in the November 19th issue of the Calgary News-Telegram. In the November 28th issue of the Free Press Prairie Farmer. And in the November 30th issue of Vancouver's Daily Province, where they listed his name twice. Corporal H.C. Baker of the 28th Battalion had advanced to the village of Passchendaele with Harold's 27th Battalion. Baker described the hellish conditions there.
The buildings had been pounded and mixed with the earth, and the shell-exploded bodies were so thickly strewn that a fellow couldn't step without stepping on corruption. I'd never experienced anything like the savagery of that assault. I was burning, my eyes, my nostrils, my throat, deep in my lungs seemed to be on fire. And no matter what I did, I couldn't stop shaking. Corporal H.C. Baker, 28th Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force.
In his diary, Harold mentions that he shot down a German plane at Passchendaele. German planes, like this one, flew low over the lines at Passchendaele, harassing the Canadians with hostile fire. Just under a year after Passchendaele, Harold would go on to shoot down a second German plane at the Battle of Cambrai. Along with his own injuries that were sustained on the 6th of November, resulting in his lengthy hospitalization, there were other soldiers who had signed up in Swan River, like Harold, who died that day.
Private Robert John Walker, who had gone with Harold on leave to Glasgow, killed in action on November 6th. He was in the 27th Battalion and was only 24 years of age. Private William Lind Vale, also in the 27th Battalion, severely wounded on November 6th. He died 11 days later, on the 17th of November. He was just 23. Private Thomas Alex Woods of the 16th Battalion, 39 years old, missing, believed killed.
The injuries Harold sustained at Passchendaele required immediate attention. In the initial phase of his treatment, Harold was transported by stretcher bearers to the 1st Canadian Field Ambulance, then a day later to the 6th Canadian Field Ambulance, and on the 9th of November to number 26 General Hospital in Étaples, France. One day later, the Battle of Passchendaele ended, with the Canadians capturing the high ground north of the village. But Harold wasn't yet done in the hospitals. On the 18th of November, he was admitted into the Passmore Edwards Hospital in the west of London, where he'd stay for over a month. Then, on the 28th of December, Harold was moved to the Edmonton Military Hospital in the north of London. "13 days later, on the 10th of January 1918, he was discharged and moved to Manor War Hospital in Epsom, Surrey. And 1 week later, he checked into the Canadian Convalescent Hospital in Epsom, where he'd stay for another 2 weeks. Then, at long last, on his discharge from the Convalescent Hospital on the 1st of February 1918, that was it. He was done with the hospitals. In May of 1918, Harold was awarded the Good Conduct Badge. Now, I'm not entirely sure how a soldier qualified for that badge, but certainly if Harold exercised patience over the course of those 3 months in 7 hospitals, it might be qualification enough to earn that badge.
songs of the boys from my own hometown.
One of the family treasures we have are these brief diaries that Grandpa Harold wrote in 1967. He wrote them on these little pads. And we think he was writing these perhaps for a speech that he was to give at the Legion in his role as chair of the Benito, Manitoba Centennial Committee. And in these diaries, Harold relates some of his experiences in the Great War. And one of his early experiences while overseas was taking 10 days leave in Glasgow, Scotland in the late spring of 1917 with several buddies who he names in the diary. And this trip to Glasgow happened before Harold had seen any combat on the battlefield. One of the men who went with Harold to Glasgow is the tall guy on the left of this picture. His name was Charles Schell. Charles, or Charlie as he was known, had signed up for service in Swan River 10 days before Harold, and the two friends had then sailed together to Liverpool on the Olympic. Charlie would survive the war, returning to Canada in 1919. The other two men are Harold in the middle and his younger brother Ira on the right. More about Ira a little later. But there are others who Harold mentions in his diary. One is Sergeant Alexander Dykes, 43rd Battalion, also from the Swan River area, but born in Scotland, 2 years older than Harold. Alexander sustained a shot wound to the elbow while in action in the summer of 1917, but ultimately he too would survive the war. Another soldier mentioned in Harold's diary is Private Richard Clark, 16th Battalion, also born in Scotland. Richard had also sailed with Harold on the Olympic. He was partially buried on the battlefield when a shell exploded and was extracted unconscious by stretcher bearers. Richard suffered shell shock, and medical notes preserved in his file indicate that he began to suffer a constant nervousness. Another friend of Harold's was Private Elgin Russell Lee, 31st Battalion, pictured here with his sister. Elgin was 3 years older than Harold and had signed up for service in Swan River in the winter of 1915. On the 15th of September 1916, Elgin suffered mortal wounds to the jaw and abdomen while on the battlefield at Pozières, France, dying at number 49 Casualty Clearing Station. The photo I'm holding in my hands is one of my absolute favorites. It's a photo of Harold and 6 of his buddies, plus his brother Ira. It was taken on that same leave in Scotland in the late spring of 1917, before any of Harold's experiences under fire on the battlefield. On the back of the photo, the names of each soldier are listed, and the person who wrote down all this information was Harold's brother Ira. This is a postcard, in fact, that Ira had sent home. What happened to these men? Private Howard Milton McDougall, 43rd Battalion, was born in 1894. Howard was killed in action at Passchendaele on the 26th of October 1917 at the age of 23. His body was never recovered. Howard is memorialized at the Menin Gate Memorial in Ypres. Lance Corporal Harold Evans Staples, my grandfather, 27th Battalion, who is the main subject of our story, He was born in 1896. He was wounded at Passchendaele on the 6th of November 1917 with shrapnel wounds to the head and a broken ankle that resulted from falling timber. Harold survived the war and returned to Canada in 1919. He died in 1973 at the age of 76. Private Robert John Walker, otherwise known as Jack Walker, 27th Battalion, born in 1892. On the 6th of November 1917, the same day that Harold was injured, Jack was killed in action at Passchendaele, and his body never recovered. He was 24 years old. He too is memorialized at the Menin Gate. Private James Edmund Webb, otherwise known as Jim Webb, 43rd Battalion, born in 1896. On the 26th of October 1917, while engaged in combat at Passchendaele, Jim's right leg was shattered and it was amputated the following day. Jim was invalided back to Canada on the 6th of June 1918. Private William M. McIntyre, 27th Battalion, born 1884. While at Lens in July 1917, a block of cement fell from a 6-foot height onto one of William's feet, crushing it. He was invalided to Canada in February of 1918. Corporal George Alexander Wright, 43rd Battalion, born in 1896. George was awarded the Military Medal, but in early 1918 he suffered wounds on the left side of his body when a grenade exploded near him accidentally during trench clearing practice. He returned to Canada at war's end in 1919. Private Angus Oswald Davey, 27th Battalion and 2nd Canadian Machine Gun Corps, born 1895. While at Passchendaele on the 7th of November 1917, Angus suffered a concussion from an exploding shell. He survived the war, returning to Canada in 1919. He died in 1974 at the age of 78. Lance Corporal Ira J. Staples, 27th Battalion, born in 1898. Ira was Harold's younger brother. Ira was killed in action on the 8th of June, 1918, at a place called Mercatel, just south of Arras, France. Just 1.5 months before his death, he'd been promoted from private to lance corporal. He was 20 years of age. Ira was laid to rest at Bellecour Military Cemetery, Rivière, France, about 12 kilometers west of the place he died. In his 1967 diary, Harold talks about returning to France after the months that he had spent in the hospitals, and he mentions his brother Ira.
In July 1918, I was once again on my way back to France, only to find many of my old buddies gone. Among them, my brother Ira.
I simply can't imagine how heartbroken Harold must have been upon realizing that his younger brother had been killed in action. Another one of the treasures that we have is a single page from a letter. The rest of the letter hasn't survived, but this letter was written by Harold to his mother on the 18th of July, 1918. And in the letter, he's trying to console his mother about her son Ira's death.
My dear mother, I received your letter of June 20 yesterday, and glad to hear from you again. But I was almost afraid to open the letters because I knew the news would be sad. But I guess I must have got the word before you did. I don't think I can tell you anything more than I have. I wrote 2 letters and told you all I could. I know, Mother, it is pretty hard to bear, but I suppose it was to be. It seems hard to realize that I am the only one left out of us 4 or 5, counting Elgin. But I can say this much, that Ira was true to you all, as well as his country.
The notice of Ira's death appeared across Canada in several newspapers. In the Saskatoon Daily Star on the 22nd of June, 1918. In the Calgary Canadian on the 24th of June, 1918. In the Montreal Gazette, also on June 24th, where they misspelled Benito as Bendit. And on page 5 of the June 28th issue of the Swan River Star. One week after Ira had been killed, Harold was sent on command to the Canadian Trench Warfare School in Bexhill, southern England. Harold would stay there in Bexhill for 2 weeks. A little later that summer, another one of Harold's friends from Swan River, Private Frank Skeet of the 16th Battalion, was also killed in action at the age of 23. Harold mentions Frank in his personal diary as another one of the soldiers in the group that had taken leave together in Glasgow the year prior. In mid-August of 1918, Harold returned to the front line in France and was promoted from private to lance corporal, meaning he had authority now over a few other privates in his section. A 1-bar chevron worn downward would have been added to his uniform. Harold's diary is helpful here. He mentions that at this point he
was put in charge of the Lewis gun section with a number of new recruits that had never been under fire, which added greatly to the responsibility.
The Lewis gun that Harold mentions there was an extremely useful light machine gun that fired .303 caliber rounds at a rate of 8 rounds per second. It had a pan magazine on top of it that held 47 rounds. And the main function of the Lewis gun was to lend supporting fire for advancing platoons, but it was also used for anti-aircraft work. This photo of the Lewis gun training class at Camp Hughes, Manitoba in 1916 shows both Harold and his buddy Charlie Schell. Something that becomes quite obvious, especially as we consider Harold's involvement with the Lewis gun in the Great War, is that he likely killed a great many people. It's an unsettling thought, but he was in a war, and his own life and the lives of many other Canadian boys would have depended on him using that gun liberally and using it accurately. According to my mom, in later life, he would often disappear every 11th of November so that he could be alone for several hours. And probably, I think, he just needed time and he needed space to process all the trauma that he had experienced. On the 9th of October 1918, in the Battle of Cambrai, Harold and his 27th Battalion had quick success in capturing the town of Ramille.
Went over the top again at Cambrai, 5 times in one day. Took the city and some prisoners.
A rather interesting note appears in the 27th Battalion's battle report for that day.
At the square near the church, an enemy machine gun opened up, but was quickly silenced by a Lewis gun section and the crew taken prisoner.
Harold's diary had mentioned the taking of prisoners, and Harold was also leading a Lewis gun section, both of which match that part of the battle report. We wonder if the German machine gun crew that the report said was quickly silenced was silenced by Harold's Lewis gun section. Perhaps it was. Interestingly, in his diary, Harold also mentions putting a second German plane out of action with his Lewis gun during this Battle of Cambrai, his first downed plane having been at Passchendaele.
Things were beginning to go in our favor, and as the old saying goes, we had the Hun on the run. And on what was to be our next action, we were on our way to Mons when we received word of the armistice.
The Battle of Mons took place during the final 2 days of the Canadian operations in World War I, the 9th and 10th of November 1918. 280 young Canadian men were killed, wounded, or went missing during those final 2 days of the war. And then, on the 11th of November 1918, armistice. The war was over.
November 11th, armistice. After about 2 weeks, we started to march to the German border. I developed the flu, which was raging at that time, and was left behind, later being sent back to England.
The raging flu that Harold mentions there was, of course, the 1918 Spanish flu. By one estimate, close to 45,000 Canadian soldiers were afflicted with it, and officially 776 of them died of the flu. On the 1st of December 1918, the flu landed Harold in the hospital once again, this time at the 7th Canadian General Hospital in Etaples.
Keep the home fires burning while your hearts are yearning. Though your lads are far away, they dream of home.
In late December 1918, Harold was discharged from the hospital, and then on the 20th of February 1919, exactly 51 years to the day before I was born, he stepped onto the SS Lapland to sail back to Canada, having spent 787 grueling days on European soil. He arrived in Halifax on the 1st of March 1919. 3 years earlier, Harold had been one of 284 fresh soldiers in A Company of the 226th Battalion. Now, as he stepped back onto Canadian soil, 51 of those 284 soldiers, or 18% of them, had died. Harold was discharged from duty in Winnipeg on the 3rd of April, 1919, now 22 years old. There's a little recorded observation in Harold's discharge papers that always makes me smile just because it's written so tersely. The doctor who examined him wrote,
Scar, left side of nose, kicked by a horse, 1907. No disability.
After his discharge in Winnipeg, Harold traveled home and was met at the train station by his future father-in-law and my great-grandfather, Dan Haw. Almost immediately, Harold went to work for Mr. Haw, cleaning seed. The next year, Harold took over the Haw farm and would later add his own father's homestead. On the 30th of March 1921, Harold married my grandmother, Ora Lillian Haw, and the following year they welcomed their first child, Dawn. They would go on to have 5 more children. This picture of the 6 kids was taken in 1940. From right to left, Derwin, Dawn, Arlene, Ronley, Peg, and the youngest, my mother, Beth. Harold would serve on the Bonito Town Council for many years, and he would also start a sawmill during the years of World War II. In 1940, he joined the Veterans Guard of Canada and trained once a week with them until the end of World War II. After World War II had ended, Harold joined the United Grain Growers and served on the board of directors for several years. He would retire from that position in 1966, and the following year he served as chairman of the Bonito Centennial Committee. Harold and Ora celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1971. He died on the 13th of June, 1973, at the age of 76. He is buried at Riverside Cemetery, west of Swan River, Manitoba. You know, so often you hear the same refrain among those whose relatives fought in the First World War. And that refrain usually goes something like this: he never liked to talk about the war. And apparently this was true of my grandfather. He tended not to raise the topic of his war experiences in conversation. But having gone through this video journey of many of his experiences, we can certainly understand why that would be. He had seen horrors. He'd lived through great trauma. He'd had many of his friends taken from him on the battlefield, and of course, he himself had taken many lives. And so it's no wonder he wasn't keen to talk about it. As he returned to Canada in 1919, there wasn't much of a system in place to help soldiers deal with, to process the trauma that they had experienced. No PTSD was diagnosed, and systems of therapy, systems of help were sorely lacking. And many soldiers, don't forget, had also come back missing limbs and missing eyes, making life even more difficult. I can only imagine the private world that must have existed in my grandfather's head during those post-war decades until his death. Thank you, Grandpa, and thank you, Granduncle Ira, for your service to this country. Every Remembrance Day, the Great War recedes further and further into the past. In fact, as I sit here today in 2024, the war ended almost 106 years ago. But as a free person in the true North, strong and free, I will continue to pay my deepest, my most sincere respects to those like you, Grandpa, Granduncle Ira, who've laid their very lives on the line so that I might enjoy my freedoms. Indeed, it is best that we remember.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the lark still bravely singing flies, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies blow in Flanders fields.
Little girl, don't cry, I must say goodbye. Don't you hear the bugle call? And the fife and drum beat the fellows come where the flag waves over all. Though I love you so, it is time to go, and a soldier in me you'll find. When on land or sea, they need boys like me. You would not have me stay behind. So send me away with a smile, little girl. Brush the tears from eyes of brown. It's all for the best, and I'm off with the rest of the boys from my own hometown. It may be forever we part, little girl, and it may be for only a while. But if fight dear we must, then on God is our trust. So send me away with a smile. When I leave you, dear, give me words of cheer to recall in times of pain. They will comfort me and will seem to me like the sunshine after rain. And mid shot and shell I'll remember well you've the heart of a soldier too. And that through this war I am fighting for my country and my home and you. So send me away with a smile, little girl. Brush the tears from eyes of brown. It's all for the best, and I'm off with the rest of the boys from my own hometown. It may be forever we part, little girl, and it may be for only a while. But if fight dear we must, then in God is our trust.